Great, welcome. Hello, everybody. I hope that you're all doing well. We are delighted to have so many of you join us today for our webinar to hear AnswerLab's Mitra Martin share some strategies for engaging and connecting with young research participants. My name is Naomi. I am part of the team here at AnswerLab. And before we get started, I just want to run through a couple of quick housekeeping items. So like most of you, I'm sure we are doing this remotely, so please do bear with us if we run into any technical difficulties. I want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded and everybody will receive a recording via email afterwards. So if you're disconnected or if we are, we will make sure that you still receive this content. In that same email, we will also be sharing some links to the resources that Mitra mentioned throughout her presentation today. And if you have any questions that you would like to submit, please do so via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We're going to cover as many of those as we can at the end. And so we have about 35 minutes of content today to ensure that we have time to get to your questions, and we are going to stay on time to keep you on track for your other commitments today. So with all that said, I would like to now hand over to Mitra.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining in the middle of a busy Q4 and getting into the holiday season. I'm really excited to share this material with you today, and it was inspiring to see all the thoughtful questions come in the registration. So here at AnswerLab, researching young people has been a big part of our work. And so today we'll be sharing a bit about what we've found effective in terms of mindset, in terms of methods, and also in terms of moderating. And I also just want to acknowledge that the territory of youth research is vast. And today we won't be talking about several very important dimensions of it, such as recruitment strategies, or the detail of legal and ethical frameworks. We've addressed recruitment in previous content, and we may address other topics in the future. But for now, our focus is going to be research design, how to prepare yourself, and what to do when you're in the room with a young person. So I'm still on a journey of learning about young people myself and constantly learning from them. But I'll start by saying I love working with young people, and not just as a researcher. I find them inspiring and fun, and also just incredibly layered and complex. And so for the next 45 minutes, I encourage you to, as you're hearing this content and these ideas, to reflect on your own relationship with young people holistically, and not just as a researcher. So maybe as a parent or an aunt or uncle or a community member. And I also want to acknowledge that I didn't always feel as comfortable with young people as I do now. And today it's still a practice. It's common to be a little intimidated by teenagers. There's always this worry they'll be dismissive or sarcastic or just kind of monosyllabic in a session. At AnswerLab, we have an internal Slack channel where we share anonymous quotable moments from sessions for comic relief. So here are a couple that came up in teen sessions, and I'll let you read them yourself since I can't properly pronounce the emojis. So I imagine some of us can relate to sessions like these when an old person says memes. But also in the same channel, here are a few others that came up. So I love this. My heart is 10 sizes too big after talking to him. I think these quotes really give a taste of the pro-social and visionary quality that I've come to associate with youth sessions. And now I'm just really glad that working with 13 to 17-year-olds, plus or minus, is such a big part of my job. And as I started to see more and more moments of vulnerability and large-heartedness and kind of this freshness in my conversations with young people, I started to wonder what could make that happen even more consistently. Stepping back, we wanted to find out how our studies with youth could help our clients benefit from the power of their perspective and help create great digital experiences for them. And we also wanted the research itself to be a great experience for the participants. Our mission at AnswerLab is to help create experiences people love, all people. And for me, being truly inclusive also means considering the unique qualities of people at all different ages and different developmental stages. So for me, the first step in real inclusivity was to examine the mental models I had about teens. And some of those mental models I realized are actually embedded in our language. You'll notice in this presentation, I refer to this population as youth, not teens. And my research has shown me that the term teens can actually reinforce some negative stereotypes related to this group. It might suggest untrustworthiness or bad judgment, which can actually lead to fear and sort of an othering approach to them. So reframing this group as youth, something that we've all experienced, it sort of highlights the action of exploration, of discovery, of experimentation and identity formation that are really a natural part of our work during this life stage. If you're interested in the work currently being done on reframing adolescence, I really recommend the Frameworks Institute's body of child and adolescent development framing research. That's a bit of a mouthful. But when you dive into the concept of adolescence itself, you learn some surprising things. So David Marshak is an educator and expert in adolescent development and one of my mentors. He highlights in his work that adolescence, as we know it today, was actually first conceptualized only a little more than 100 years ago, and has only been part of our society for a few generations. So let that sink in for a minute. Before this, youth lived and worked as young adults. So the creation or the invention, you could say, of adolescence, which was first coined in 1904 in a paper by G. Stanley Hall, it actually led to the exclusion of young people from many important aspects of adult life, and also many opportunities to learn and to contribute to society that for thousands of years before that, they had always been a part of. So as researchers today, we have an opportunity to include them again. And in fact, from what I see, research is actually one of the only institutions that is systematically giving young people a voice in the creation of their world. But we can only do this to the extent that we understand them. And I believe that including young people in sensitively designed research that reflects their developmental stage is a beautiful way to take them out of this almost marginalized group that they were placed in when they were given the label teenager, and to help sort of reincorporate their very imaginative perspective and their sensitivity into this world. And they really do have, I would almost call it a unique form of wisdom. According to James Chilton Pierce, who is another scholar who studied youth, young people during this phase of development have 3 felt qualities. And I invite you to think of a young person you know, 12 or 13 to 17 or even 18, around this age, and ask yourself how these qualities express themselves through that person as I go through them. So the first quality is what we could call an energetic and powerful idealism. It's often a little raw, a little exaggerated, but it's true in its core nature. And the flip side of this is that if you disappoint their ideals, they'll likely withdraw and not cooperate. The second is a feeling of great expectations for their own life. This is almost a sense of calling or a sense of pull, and a sense that something life-changing may occur at any moment, including maybe in this very research interview or the research conversation that you're having with them. And the third quality is a hidden greatness. So there's this sense that they are or they have something extremely special and extraordinary that no one else understands. And when we converse with them, creating real space for their special and unique view is how we actually meet them. So take a moment and reflect how these qualities might express themselves in in a young person you know, either from your life or in the media, and if you can recognize these qualities. I think as a culture, we've recently had an opportunity to see the power of youth in the figure of Greta Thunberg, who embodies these qualities of powerful idealism, devotion to a calling, and a connection with something larger. And it's possible that every young person has something of her leadership potential if engaged in the right way. And I think just acknowledging this and being of the mindset that it's a possibility is the first step in designing research that intentionally invites youth to bring the fullness of their imagination to our companies and to our products. I've really had the joy of witnessing these qualities in tiny ways in the research process over the years. So in terms of idealism, I've done extensive sibling research and talked with young people who showed just extraordinary commitment to helping and protecting their younger sisters and brothers online. In terms of calling, I've met with 7th graders who were developing these intense entrepreneurial ventures involving creating and selling slime. Yes, slime, of all things. And just watching how they were collaborating so closely with one another and with so much devotion with their other slime colleagues and to help build each other's respective businesses. And finally, in terms of hidden wholeness, I've seen young people really reflecting in quite a nuanced way on interpersonal frictions and loyalty, and designing spaces for themselves that allow them to playfully express the different layers of who they are and who they're becoming within online communities. So just kind of reflecting on a lot of faces coming up in my memory at this point of memories of conversations I've had with these folks. I think obviously each of these kinds of stories has enormous implications for brands and for products. But to unlock all of this, we really need to inhabit their world. So how do we do that? I want to talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of moderating and interaction. So as I mentioned, the people we call teens live in a way in a marginalized role in society. To them, it can often feel that their opportunities to influence change are so small compared with the hugeness of the vision and the energy that they have. Most of the time in their lives, they're answering to others. They're doing what they're told to do by a parent or a teacher or a community leader. I've actually found that it's relatively rare for a young person to really experience being the center of really high quality attention, where someone is really interested in them and in their perspective. So all my work with youth is focused around giving them that sense that I really, really respect them and their words. And I'm really curious about the details of their real experience, and that I want them to feel free and have a sense of agency. Agency meaning the power to decide what will happen. So now I'll take you through how we at AnswerLab help this happen in a research interview. So every interview has a few key moments, and I see these as essential to solidifying a productive research interaction with a young person. So the interview actually begins before the interview, of course, and what happens before the interview with a young person is as important as what happens in it. So here's where you set the stage for how you will respect them. So in addition to securing informed consent from the parent, of course, be sure you're also giving the young person an opportunity to assent to the research and providing them with information about what they will experience in simple, natural, easy to understand, and age-appropriate language. So sometimes this is referred to as dual screening, and your research ops team or your recruiter who's used to recruiting youth should be very familiar with it. But here in the pre-interview is also where you tell them the purpose of the interview. You tell them that it will be recorded, that you'll ask them to keep it confidential, that there may be observers, and any other details that you want to think through that they may want to consider before agreeing to the session. I believe that for many subjects, it's important and appropriate to give young people an opportunity to share without being mediated by their parent's presence. And if that's the case, you'll want to ensure that both the parent and the young person know this and agree to it in advance, and be ready to remind everyone of it once the session begins, or to discontinue the session. And of course, before the session, you also want to do your homework or talk to an informant so you know all the key terms and concepts that relate to the product or the domain. Then we get into the intro. So it's really critical in these sessions. When you meet the young person, as you build rapport, it's also important to reference what they've agreed to and to reinforce that agency in detail. So it's not enough to get informed consent. You also need to get ongoing consent. Because once the interview starts, there's actually a power asymmetry due to your status as an adult and also as the interviewer. So be sure you take the time to explicitly let the participant know that you want them to feel comfortable, that they can stop at any time, that they don't have to answer any question that they don't feel like, and that they will still get paid. I find also, going back to something I mentioned before, that the intro is a wonderful opportunity to highlight the power that this conversation has to help people and to help create change. Many young people I've found just find this incredibly motivating. And you can, let your participant know that you specifically wanted to talk to them because you believe that their perspective is very important to the work that you're doing. And that you've personally seen how conversations like this can have an impact. So these reminders really speak to the deep needs that young people have to contribute and to be heard, that are part of this life stage. I'll say I also don't usually use the old line that there are no right or wrong answers, because this really frames the interview as kind of a Q&A situation. And although it is that to some degree, young people are very used to there being right answers when any adult is questioning them. So instead, I try to frame it as a conversation in which I'm hoping to learn from them and get a peek into their world. Then we get into what I'm calling sort of the opening dance. So I take a lot of time with rapport building. For young kids, I ask, what did you do today? And go into the details of their day. And it's important to make space for realness, especially during these times with COVID. How's school? What's the transition been like? How do you feel about it? Showing real curiosity about life and little things, and even if it's not directly relevant to your research objectives. And I also find that if or when they share more raw or emotional material, it's okay to improvise and express empathy. Wow, that must be really hard, or oh man, I'm really sorry you're dealing with that. And it's important with youth to make sure that your sessions are spacious enough for this. Then we get into sort of probing. So during the interview, this is about using their terms to invite stories and elicit stories. So continue to reference agency when probing, for instance, by repeating their words and pausing instead of asking questions. So varying the question structure to maintain the framing of the event as a conversation as opposed to a Q&A. So they may say something like, he was sharing stuff that was really cringy. Cringy, tell me more. Or I think I know what you mean, but can you say more about it? Or, caveating questions that may be difficult to answer with, would you be up for sharing a little more about that? So again, giving them the agency. Exploring sensitive topics that may connect with trauma is beyond the scope of this conversation. But if that's something you'll be doing, it's very important to learn about trauma-informed care and how that may apply to research to develop more trauma literacy. So many people of all ages are, of course, have experienced and are experiencing trauma, unfortunately. I love this, connecting the dots. So going back to the theme of respect, one really important way of showing and really embodying that respect is by actively making note of what they say verbatim. So if you're like me, you'll actually write it down longhand as they say it, sort of keywords or phrases. and then referencing their own actual words later on, if and when relevant. And I try to do this as early in the interview as possible, because once they start to notice how actively you're listening to the actual things that they say, they'll open up more and more, and sort of, you know, you'll be able to access deeper and deeper layers of the conversation. And finally, oops, back. What I call the advisory. I really love to allocate time at the end of a session for the young person to sort of play the role of an advisor. You know, if you could give advice to, you know, such and such company, you know, what would you say? In a study I did, I asked every young person at the end what advice they had, and almost all of them said the same surprising thing that didn't have anything to do with the particular objective. So we get some interesting signal out of that. I also use the final moments of a session to find something very specific to celebrate about them, either about the way they, what they brought to the session, or something that they're doing in or with their lives, and to reference what they shared about their life to wish them luck with what they're experiencing and what they're doing. So with all of this, it does mean that you may need to allocate a little extra time for this expanded intro and the advisory at the end, but I find it's really well worth it. I found you can't rush or kind of cram tons into an interview with youth and expect it to be productive. It may offend their sense of idealism and can suggest that you only care about their answers and not them. My sense after doing hundreds of interviews is that young people are somehow like viscerally connected to other minds and other hearts through their devices, and almost as part of a single brain or a single body. And harmony and connection is experienced not just as content, as what you say, but as interpersonal timing. So they have a real keen sense of this. You know, with friends, sometimes replying to a message in 20 minutes is appropriate. And in some situations, 20 hours is okay, but there are situations where like 20 seconds is almost too much. So they deduce others' authenticity on, based on how well their timing expresses connection. So what this means for us as researchers is that in order to help young people share their wisdom and share their experiences with us, we need to start to embody that amazing timing. And we need to be hyper attuned to the timing of communication and replies. I mean, it's never been enough to just read from a static list of questions, but with youth, I believe we need to take our ability to improvise to another level. And this actually really begins before the research event, in the design of the study in the first place. It's even more possible to get that connection if, leading up to the interview, we live in their world and we acclimate to its conception of time. So now I'm thinking of a diary study that we carried out on a social media platform that youth used a great deal. And so we actually used social media posts, ephemeral content, and direct messages to help ensure diary completion. I've personally done a lot of partner dancing, and my experience of working with youth is that first few moments are really like starting to dance. I'm more likely to have a revealing and generative interview and interaction if I can match and mirror their body language and energy level, their vocal tone, their facial expressions, and sort of lead from there. So I believe that any type of embodied improvised practice that you do can be helpful, if just a helpful practice to explore if you want to understand and connect with youth from moment to moment. Finally, I want to point out that holding young people in respect also means, of course, ensuring that the work you and your team or company is doing isn't harming them. This is, of course, seldom black and white in a very complex world we live in which products can be used in all kinds of surprising ways. But I believe we're bound as research practitioners to reflect thoughtfully on the ethics of our work, and discern carefully whether we see our insights being used in ways that we feel good about. So I believe that George I. and Sarah Cantor at Greater Good Studio have provided a framework for this with their gut checks work. And I also want to mention the Center for Humane Technology, which has provided some valuable contributions on ethical design. All right, getting into design. Young people have many identities, and I've come to believe that one single interview with a 13, 15, 17-year-old is really the tip of an iceberg. And of course, we can't explore the whole iceberg, and that's probably not our role, but going a few levels deeper can often be incredibly productive. So different contexts bring out different sides of them. I mean, this is something that's true for all of us, but especially youth. So since young people's needs and emotions and behavior can change so dramatically from one context to another, it's really helpful to actually design multi-context studies to bring out all the relevant dimensions. So I like to think about these three different elements of context. The context as who, so who they are when they're alone may be different from who they are with a parent or with a sibling or with a friend. When is a powerful context. They may be very different during the school year or during the summer and have different thoughts and reflections. And then finally, the context as where. Are you meeting them in the home, in a facility, on a digital platform? This is a little bit limited with what we have available to us now, but even the difference between having a conversation with them in their own room versus in a family space can be dramatic. So when you need to learn the youth perspective, you'll likely get a more complete picture by a sequence of multiple methods. So a few ways that we've done this is by tacking on individual meet and greets before an in-home visit, or what I particularly love, in-depth interviews followed by dyads or triads, so that you have a chance to get to know the young person or the young people individually, and then also in pairs or in groups. Or follow up IDIs after a group discussion or a diary study to really go deeper into some of the things that were raised. And we should also consider as we construct this, if our research is taking place, again, during the school year or the summer or the holidays, and being strategic, making sure it's timed in such a way to help access what your stakeholders need the most. If the age group you're studying has an important milestone coming up, like entering high school is huge, or getting their first phone, it may be important to consider research that happens both before and after that milestone. I've found lately, this is one of my favorite things, that the most important element of multi-context research is how those who are part of the young person's life might be incorporated into the research event. So we've been exploring the potential of paired work with youth for a long time, and I've found that dyads actually have some amazing superpowers. In a way, they can give you a leg up on the challenge of authentic timing that we spoke about before, because the pair actually brings with it its own timing, and you can observe that and attune to it. So it can, in a way, shortcut rapport building. And also participants in a dyad bring out facets of one another. They even ask each other questions that help you understand each one's perception of a product or its features. It can help make shyer participants more comfortable. But keep in mind that it's also possible in a dyad for a more assertive participant to overly influence the conversation. So you'll need to watch out for this and ensure you're inviting the quieter participant to share first some of the time. So, related to that, I don't think dyads are a substitute for interviews where all that trust is built, but they're a great complement. In a dyad, you can also task the pair and watch them work together. You can probe each one's nonverbals. Oh, I see you laughed, or you made a face when she did that. What were you thinking? And kind of go into this mood of like research as eavesdropping, and learn a great deal that way. So I hope this has sparked some ideas for how you might design research to incorporate the youth perspective next year, and has given you some approaches that you can draw on in your interviews. As you reflect on that, to bring this to life in a small way, I also invite you over the next few weeks, when you may be interacting with youth, either in person or online, to informally interview a young person that you know. So it could be a niece or a nephew, a son or a daughter or a friend. Take something that's mysterious to you, say Minecraft or TikTok or Roblox, or maybe it's a sport they do or a theater thing, Hamilton or hockey, and just get really curious and humble and respectful and see what you can learn in a conversation with them, trying out some of these things. So with that, I'll give you a moment to think about that and turn to the questions that are coming in. Go ahead and stop the share here. All right. Got a few questions here. And I think one of them that I want to speak to, I'm seeing sort of a theme here that also relates to some comments that, that came up earlier, that there's a big difference between a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old, and also questions about sort of under 13. There's no magic, nothing magical specifically about the age 13. So something that I've been learning more about recently is that young people, there's sort of 3 different phases of adolescence, which is super interesting to kind of dive into. And the first is sort of like a destabilizing phase, which can be anywhere from 10 actually to 14, where there's kind of like a lot of change in the person's body, their consciousness, their sexuality, and this can be like a very challenging and difficult time. Then there's the second stage of adolescence, which can be maybe roughly like 15 to 17, where puberty is complete and they're growing more capacity for abstract thought, and they're sort of more involved in moral reasoning. So this is where some of that sort of thinking about right and wrong comes in. And then there's sort of a third phase, which can start 18 and beyond, but can also start earlier, where there's more sort of rational thought, planning about the future, emotional stability. So there's a little bit of differences across these stages. Let's see. Wow, there's so many great questions here. Let's see. I was particularly taken by your encouragement to dig into trauma-informed practices to guide our craft in interviewing youth. Do you have any suggestions as to where to start looking? There's a whole domain of trauma-informed care, which I think is super interesting to apply to the research events. So trauma-informed care is sort of characterized by these principles of safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment. So really thinking about how those kind of are playing out both before and during and after the research session. Let's see. All right. Wow, so many great questions. What are some ways of respectfully refocusing the conversation? What can you say? So refocusing the conversation, I'm guessing from this that you've had the experience of noticing that a question you've asked, that the participant is sort of going off on different tangents. I would suggest trying to make it as concrete as possible. So for instance, asking them to tell you a story, asking for a specific example of something that you're interested in. I found it really helpful if you have consent and if they're prepared to invite them to share their screen, whether it's their phone screen or their digital screen to keep it very rooted in very, something very concrete. And then that naturally gets very grounded stories to start taking shape. All right. Let's see. How many meetings do you find it usually takes to build trust pre-interview? That's a good question. And that would probably be something that I would direct to our research ops team. I know there are different ways to go about it. And you can also sort of get to know a young person, not necessarily through live conversations or phone calls, but also by inviting them to, say, record a video and submit it, or get a sense of them in different ways that are more connected to the media that they're comfortable in. When is it appropriate to use dyads as a research method? So I think dyads are a really flexible method for engaging with young people. I've used them mostly in foundational work, so really exploratory work where I want to understand the nature of relationships within a household, when I want to understand how those are impacting the use of a product or the perceptions of a brand. But I know some of my colleagues have also used dyads really in a more usability context to kind of understand how young people are interacting with for instance, an app that involves more than one of them at once, so like a messaging app or something that kind of is built on interaction between people. And dyads are so flexible. You can do parent child dyads, you can do sibling dyads, you can do peer group dyads, and each one kind of has a really different flavor. So you really have to kind of get close to what your objectives are. And what I'm hoping you'll take away from this is to consider whether dyads might be a way to sort of reveal some of that, some of those different facets. And again, I find it really helpful to pair it with the one-on-one interviews. Let's see. What are the top things to consider when running remote interviews with youth? I think we covered that a bit, especially if there was no introduction to a researcher prior to the session. Yeah, to me, everything flows from being in that mindset of seeing them as kind of a mystery and being excited about that, being really curious about them, and really interested in the details of their life and being willing to show that and improvise with the script in order to do that. So yeah, I think just that level of preparation of kind of mind and heart really helps make the most out of the research questions, and of course it can be really helpful to run mock sessions or practice in advance. Let's see. Do you have any special advice for working with youth on making sure that a pause in the conversation stays as an invitation to respond and doesn't become uncomfortable for them? Yeah, I love that question. I think young people sort of take on the values that and the behaviors that we as adults take on. And I think in our culture generally, silence and kind of like a pause can feel very uncomfortable. And there may be you may even want to be sensitive here and, interpret that their pause might be a withdrawal of consent to continue. So there could be a lot of stuff going on there. So I would suggest sort of, really tuning into their nonverbals and sort of asking what's going on, or even asking sort of a meta question about the question. So is that really difficult to answer? Is the question I ask difficult to answer? Or how does it feel to be thinking about this? To see if they're kind of really reflecting on it, or whether they're just uncomfortable. Let's see. You mentioned that you don't say there are any right or wrong answers at the beginning, and what you say instead to ease those concerns. Do you still frequently find that people get embarrassed when they feel like they don't know enough about the topic you're asking about? I'm just kind of scanning interviews I've done in the past. And that's not standing out. I don't find that they feel embarrassed. I think on the contrary, I almost try to, I don't know, to give them the sense that that what I'm asking about may be the wrong thing, or what I'm showing them is just a really rough draft, and it might have mistakes, and that it's probably kind of messy, and we're going to help figure out what's wrong with it. So I think kind of like reframing it as that to normalize errors and normalize the idea of mistakes can be really helpful. Yeah, I hope that helps. Let's see, and one more question, and then I think we're going to probably wrap up. Any advice on how to handle a larger group brainstorm session? 25 people. Yeah, so I would question using that format for young people. I think large groups kind of can bring out patterns and dynamics that maybe aren't so conducive to really deep understanding and showing respect. It's more like there's a sense that you're going to need to put a lot of energy into managing the group dynamic and less into really understanding the people and the relationships. So yeah, I would keep discussion sessions as small as possible. And I don't know as much about sort of online Zoom-based discussions, but I think 3 to 5 is is probably the best number for a group discussion with young people. And it also depends on their relationship with each other and what they have in common. And also in some cases, gender, depending on their age. So I hope that was helpful. I'm going to invite you to stay connected. I'm on LinkedIn and also on Medium, and I'm going to go ahead and pass it back to Naomi.
Thanks, Mitra. That was great. So that about wraps it up for today. I'd like to thank you all for joining us. And if you found this discussion informative, you can follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram. We also produce lots of great content on all things UX on our Insights blog, and I encourage you to check that out too. So with that, I would like to thank you all for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.